Okay, good morning, everyone. Glad to see the sun's out today. Hopefully you'll get a chance to have a nice walk around campus for those of you who don't normally live here. I saw a kingfisher this morning. That was exciting, just down there by the pond. So yeah, that's my morning. This is not so Ceres' talk is not technically part of the workshop. It's part of the longer series that we've been running over the month of TSVP talks by our visiting scholars. But thank you all for turning up regardless. I did sneakily put it on the schedule. And I for one am really excited to hear a talk with a tagline. It's been ages since I've seen a talk with a subtitle. So loving from theory or maybe not so much to decision making. Yeah. Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Ceres Barros, which is the best I can do of a Portuguese pronunciation, who's a research scientist at the BC Ministry of Forests in Canada, but will in about 2 weeks, I think, be transitioning to a position at the Canadian Forest Service in the Pacific Forestry Centre. And so I've known Ceres for a few years. We've been doing similar things, interested in similar things, I think. And so it's nice to get a chance to hear about your work in more detail, Ceres. So please take it away.
Thank you so much, Sam. And thank you to the OIS team and everybody here for being here, for organizing this wonderful workshop, the seminar series as well. Full disclosure, I have not come here as a ministry employee. So everything I'm going to say is my own view and not necessarily the view of the government. So full disclosure, I have to say that. Yeah, so now that we got that out of the way, I'm going to present a little bit of my work over the past few years on how I've been trying to make more holistic assessments of ecosystem stability to multiple global change drivers. And the way I do this is to draw a little of inspiration from theory, but not as much that decision makers go like, oh, I don't understand. And so trying to make a little bit more tangible for managers. Right, so I'd like to start by talking a little bit about complex systems, like these forests of the Rocky foothills in Alberta in Canada. They are the result of very complex interplays between species dynamics, species interactions, but also several types of disturbances with their own regimes. We have fire, grazing, and pests and drought that have been part of these systems for millennia. And they follow both variations in climate, but also the feedbacks between their cycles of disturbance and the vegetation. Grazing and fire have also been the result of human influence for many millennia, as indigenous peoples have used fire to create forest openings for ungulate grazing, but also to clear understory vegetation for important medicinal and forage plants. So the cycles that we have observed in the past are not necessarily natural. They're a mix of human intervention and natural cycles of climate and so on. After European settlers arrived, these disturbance regimes that were partly natural, partly human-made, were altered in only a few decades. Cultural burning was prohibited, forest management for timber became widespread, and ungulates no longer roamed the land as they once did, and fire suppression was done very aggressively to protect economic values, but also populations, because they no longer were nomad, no longer were able to move from place to place easily. And today we are seeing the legacy of decades of timber-focused management, which combined with fast climate change is leading to unprecedented changes in fire regimes, in pest dynamics, and very widespread drought mortality and reductions in the ability of, let's say, tree species to regenerate after a drought event or even a fire event or other disturbance events. And this is very problematic. It's urgent that we move towards sustainable ecosystem management that not only protects ecosystem resilience, but recovers it where it's been lost and enhances it where it has to reach another level. This requires a deep understanding of where we are in terms of the states of these forests, how far we've pushed them, and how far we are from a desirable state that might not be the state that we had 200 years ago. That might not be possible anymore. It also requires that we consider multiple ecosystem properties, multiple ecosystem entities, and multiple ecosystem processes so that we can safeguard many ecosystem services, not just one, and many ecosystem values that might not be necessarily services. And a bit surprisingly, or maybe not so much, is that the concepts of resilience, which in many places in terms of policy and management frameworks is called resiliency. This word, these two words are everywhere in these policy frameworks, but nobody that is doing management and decision-making really knows how to get there. It's a word, but it's very undefined, very unclear how we get there. And so I believe that to reach sustainable management, to foster this resilience, we really need metrics, indicators of resilience or stability, whatever you want to call it, because we know it's multifaceted, that do capture this multidimensionality of systems, but also that are transferable to different systems under different disturbances and understandable by practitioners and decision makers. And the reason why I think this is extremely important is decision makers have to constantly make decisions about where to allocate funding, where to do this or that approach to manage for resilience. If the metrics are not transferable, if we cannot compare the relative resilience of systems, they don't have to be very different, but just different plant communities, for example, it'll be very hard for them to make that decision. I also think we need more and more to use forecasting models that can capture these multiple interacting disturbances and the consequences of these disturbances for many ecosystem properties and values. If we don't get our crystal ball out and try to predict something that might happen in the future, it's very hard for managers to know what to do. And finally, this is a little bit off of the other two topics, but it's something I've become quite passionate about, is that I feel that we need to embed our work on repeatable, reproducible, reusable, and transparent forecasting tools, or any tools that speed up scientific update by managers and decision makers. And I have to tell you, it is very frustrating to see how slow science makes it to this realm. It is very slow. And I keep telling my colleagues, we know that already, do something. We have a body of literature telling us this is the consequence, so do it. But it's very slow. And I think it really helps if our tools are very transparent and can be just readily updated and uptaken by these managers. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list of things we have to do, but these are the 3 ones that I've been working more actively on. And so I think I like to say that this kind of goes from theory to practice a little bit, but it's a very blurred sort of gradient. Right, so I'll start by talking a little bit about those 2 first themes of how I've been using multidimensional indicators of stability and resilience in a forecasting setting, not in a theory testing setting. And the reason I do this is because I like combining ecological forecasting models with these indicators, because I think that when we are able to analyze ecosystem stability under different scenarios of, let's say, real disturbance, and I put it quotes because it's still a model, it's still a simulation, that gives us a little bit more tangible information for management. It also allows us to identify certain ecosystems or species or areas that might be of more concern than others under different practices and the different scenarios of disturbance. And it also allows us to do, of course, hypothesis testing, although I'm only going to talk about these 2 for today. And so in the past, I've mostly used landscape vegetation models or dynamic landscape vegetation models. I've used Fate HD, and now I am a core developer of the Lander model. And I'm just going to very briefly introduce these two to you. Fate HD was first published by Isabelle Boulangeat, and then I developed a little bit more of the model. It basically simulates the population dynamics, interactions, dispersal of different plant functional groups that are mostly phanerophytes, trees, chamophytes, shrubs, and herbaceous species. And it simulates their responses as well to different types of disturbances. And you can simulate scenarios of change to then reproduce vegetation dynamics and states under different conditions. Lander is not so different, but instead of simulating all of these different types of plants, it only focuses on trees at the moment. We will try to develop other types of approaches to simulate shrubs and herbs, but herbs are very different from trees, and it's hard. And so basically it does, simulates the interactions, population dynamics, dispersal of different tree species across a landscape to just reproduce forest dynamics and states under different conditions. We also simulate changes in gradual changes in temperature, fire, and are developing other disturbances too. Lander, the big advantage of it for me is that it's implemented in a commonly understood language. Most ecologists know R, few ecologists know C++, Sharp, et cetera, and it's embedded in a modeling toolkit called Spades. And so what Spades and R do in this case is that, well, R allows most ecologists to understand what the hell we're writing inside that model. And so we can literally give it to an ecologist that doesn't necessarily know modeling, but maybe understands how trees grow. And we can say, hey, does this look okay to you? So we have that feedback from other colleagues, and that's very important. And Spades promotes this modularity sort of approach where we try to make Lander compatible with a lot of different modules. So for example, we have 3 different fire disturbance modules, 1 of carbon, and et cetera. And we can sort of swap these around and test hypotheses about model uncertainty, for example, benchmarking models, or just testing different processes and how they influence the forest. So that's why I like Lander a lot. The reason I say these are hybrid ecological simulation models is because they combine both mechanistic approaches with statistical approaches to simulate the ecological processes we're interested in. Right, so I've been interested in using these models to explore different questions of ecosystem stability. With Fate HD, I used simulation experiments to investigate the stability of different alpine, and that's alpine with a big A, not alpine because they're high in the mountain necessarily, so just in the Alps, different alpine vegetation communities to different types of disturbances. So just simulation experiments to understand responses of shrublands, grasslands, and forests to different combinations of these disturbances. And Lander I've used to investigate forest stability under different regimes of disturbance. I won't talk about that today, but I will talk about how we've been using it to understand or investigate the resilience of boreal land bird communities to climate change. And in this case, we're also, running different scenarios of climate change and looking at the responses of land bird community structure. But how do we do that? It's complex because we have very large landscape scales usually. And in this case, for example, we have different types of communities that have different time scales of variation, et cetera. And in this case, it wasn't very clear to me how do we analyze resilience of birds, because I was more used to plants. And so I've applied the n-dimensional hypervolumes framework to look at the relative stability of different plant communities, and now we're applying the cross-scale model of resilience that Rachel mentioned yesterday to look at land bird community resilience. Right, so on to the n-dimensional hypervolumes framework. The big question for me when I started studying the stability of different alpine communities was that I found it was very hard to quantitatively compare the stability of very different communities when we're using those single metrics of productivity. Does it make sense to just literally compare their variation in terms of, does a forest vary more than grassland? Can we compare that directly or not? They have very different temporal dynamics. So I just started getting very confused about how I would apply those typical stability metrics to this work. And I also was a little frustrated because I thought, well, if we're only measuring community biomass variation, what happens to those very rare species that have very little contribution to total biomass, but could have a very important contribution to other aspects of community stability and properties? Is there a problem that we're trying to collapse everything into like a one total biomass metric? And so I got thinking and I thought, well, what I'm really, really interested in is to capture the covariation of multiple ecosystem components like species or traits, and look at their variation under different states and compare those different states. And so I proposed the use of hypervolumes to describe how changes in ecosystem structure and organization follow a perturbation. And so the idea is that if we think about a stable state before a disturbance, we can plot it in a multidimensional space of the properties we're interested in. So here it's just 3 little species, very different trees, herbs, and shrubs. And the system will vary dynamically even when it's stable, right? And that will create this cloud of points in a multidimensional space. After we perturb the system, we expect it to change a little bit, and then eventually it can stabilize in a very different state or not. And we can describe that new dynamic, basically, that new state as another cloud of points. And the reason I use hypervolumes is because they have really useful metrics that I didn't have to make up to compare these two states. And we can also build hypervolumes in the middle, like the transient dynamic hypervolumes are also possible, and I've done that. And the metrics that I've been using are the amount of overlap between pre and post disturbance hypervolumes, and it tells us in general how much the community changed. So if they don't overlap at all, then there's basically nothing similar between those two states. There's the distance between the hypervolume centroids, which tells us about average changes or changes in the average values of those properties. And changes in the size of the hypervolumes will tell us something about the variability of that state. Did the dynamic become less variable or more variable after the disturbance? And so this is a very multidimensional assessment of stability. Not only are we capturing different dimensions and their contribution to these changes, but also we have 3 different metrics that have to sort of be combined and interpreted together. The other thing that I thought it was neat is that when we use the same scaled axis to make hypervolumes, we can compare between very different communities. And so this allowed me to compare the relative resilience or relative stability of forests with respect to grasslands to a given disturbance or a different disturbance. And so I thought that was quite neat and maybe useful for management when we need comparative analysis. And so just an example of what I did, I simulated vegetation dynamics in the Écrin National Park, which is here in the French Alps. The Écrin has, important gradients of topographic variation with climate variation. And so grasslands, shrublands, forests coexist in relatively short amounts or spans of space. And there's a very important, there's a problem that they're facing in terms of management in the econ, which is because of climate change, a lot of the open habitats, the grasslands are suffering shrub encroachment. And they're trying to maintain these grasslands open, even though there's a lot of land use abandonment. So there's a lot of people are not taking their sheep or cows anymore up the mountain to keep these grasslands open. So there's some interesting problems going on there. But I was interested in knowing whether drought would impact these dynamics. Because if we have very intense drought, then we also expect trees to not fare very well. So will we see the same type of encroachment that we would under just the scenario of gradual climate warming? And so what I did was I looked at the effects of a gradual climate change only scenario, a gradual climate change in mild drought, and gradual climate change in intense drought. So these three different scenarios, and how they impacted changes in forests that are not managed, and changes in grasslands that are not managed or grazed. And I compare that to a no change scenario. So basically this gives us our baseline for hypervolume changes. It's like our neutral model, let's say. And what we have here is, so the dashed line is our zero effect, that neutral model of no change. And we have standardized effect sizes on the y-axis of the three different scenarios in the same colors. And I'm looking at how the scenarios impacted mean distances between the pre and post disturbance hypervolumes, the size changes between the pre and post disturbance hypervolumes, and their overlap. And what we see is that across all of these three different communities, there's a decrease in overlap. So there is change. Some change more than the others. And we do see a general trend for drought and gradual climate warming to be similar, except when grasslands were managed. We also saw that centroids in general became more distant, but this again depends on the community, how much. But size changes really depend on the community. So grasslands didn't necessarily become more variable in their dynamics, whereas forests did seem to become a little bit more variable. And what I found interesting is that although managed grasslands overall change the most, so the overlaps are the smallest, we don't see the largest changes in mean values. And this is important because when we're aggregating properties and averaging them out, we might not be seeing the overall community structural changes that the overlap can show us. Because these hypervolumes can be really wonky. In this case, you won't see it because it's only a few dimensions that I can plot, but they can be wonky. And so maybe your mean value is sort of in the same place, but your hypervolume is very different. Even if the size is not bigger, it's just like more wonky or less. So it's interesting. And I've then complemented these analyses with just more typical analysis of what changed in the community. So in this case, I'm looking at changes in unmanaged forest in terms of tree relative abundance and functional composition. The P's are the eigenvectors because I use PCAs to simplify the dimensions a little bit for the hypervolumes. And so what we see is that tree relative abundance doesn't increase a lot in these unmanaged forests. That's not surprising. There were forests already, so there's some competition effects happening there. But it does increase still, and the increases follow climate warming, gradual warming. The drought effects are pulse-like, you can see on the intense, but it's just generally the same trend. We don't see a reversal of encroachment or tree abundance there. Just good for these forests, I guess. What we do see is that, so the black hypervolume is the neutral one, which is the same as the pre-disturbance one. And the blues are the scenario one. So they're very close. And we saw that forests didn't change very much. But we did see that we have a decrease in SLA, specific leaf area, and a decrease in moisture requirements for these species, with some increases in seed mass and leaf dried matter content, So some of these traits are associated with getting more species that are more drought adapted, more adapted to warm environments. So there was definitely a functional shift, even if the community didn't structurally change a lot. So multidimensional assessments of stability were decomposed into overall mean and variance changes. This is interesting and important, I think. And we did have some scale-free and system-independent measures of stability that allowed us to comparatively assess the stability of different communities, which could be important for management and allocation of funds when you have to make choices. For Lander, and to shift gears a little bit, we're going to talk about land-bird community resilience and how we've been applying the cross-scale model of resilience. This is really the work of Anna Raimundo, who is a PhD student at the University of Laval, Quebec. And she's been very interested in boreal land-bird community changes under climate change. And so we've been seeing how to apply the cross-scale model of resilience to this. And this model really comes from the discontinuities theory of hauling, which basically states that biological systems are hierarchically structured into discontinuous domains of influence. So biological entities, processes, properties cluster at certain temporal and spatial scales where they interact more closely. So whatever is at that scale interacts more closely than with this scale, although they're all dependent, right? And so basically, if we look at birds in a forest, the small birds are likely to interact more with each other than with the large birds and so on. And at the same time, they also interact with smaller scales of their habitat. And so species are then distributed along discontinuous gradients of body mass. And these discontinuities between the gradients reflect these transitions between structuring processes and scaling regimes. And because communities are maintained by self-organizing processes, we expect that when they are resilient, even if the identity of the species change, the arrangement shouldn't change, and we should maintain function by keeping the functional diversity within and across scales. If the community is pushed far beyond its resilience boundaries, then we expect a full reorganization of the structure. So we can basically classify all of these species into functional groups and then calculate metrics of resilience, which are within scale redundancy of the function and cross-scale redundancy of the same function. And both of them should provide higher resilience. And I put the equations here, but basically cross-scale redundancy is the average number of aggregations where a function is present. Within scale redundancy is the average number of species per functional group within an aggregation. So it's a little wordy, but just look at the drawing, it's easier. And then we can also measure within scale diversity. So how many functions do you have in each scale? And I like this model because it has a very holistic perspective on ecosystem resilience that links to different aspects of biodiversity. Within a single scale, resilience increases with increasing redundancy of functional traits. So there's some functional redundancy and functional diversity notions there. It also increases with increasing response diversity because species should respond differently to disturbances. The more you have this within the scale, the more resilience you have. And then it also considers the role of scaling and hierarchical structure for ecosystem resilience. The more scales at which a function is present, the higher the cross-scale resilience, because species at different scales respond to different disturbances and differently. And so what we've been doing is we basically simulated changes in presence, absence in 72 bird species in response to direct effects of climate change and indirect effects of climate change via changes in the forest dynamics and fire dynamics in these forests. So basically Lander was linked with a few different modules. And Anna simulated 3 different climate change projections. The emission scenario is the same, but each of these models is in a different projects different warming scenarios, basically. And we see that for all of these, so we go from cold to hot, and there's 3 timescales here from 2011 to 2091. We have increases in species richness, but a little different. The trend is not the same between the short term and the long term. So we have an initial loss of species, and then species start coming northwards towards the end of the century. So what does it mean for the resilience? We have increasing or decreasing species richness, so what? So what we saw was that increasing species richness increased the number of aggregations in these communities, but we lost within scale redundancy, and this is only one of the models, and increased cross-scale redundancy at the last time step, but not in the middle. So the trends are different, short and long term, and this is important for management because we might need to do different management, long term and short term. And we have very distinct patterns between north and south communities. So south communities are being, let's say, invaded by Alberta birds. Northern communities mostly lose those very boreal species at the start. And if we zoom into one of those pixels, we see very important changes in the structuring of the community. I still am not sure how applicable this theory is in low richness settings, because the definition of these gaps is a little bit tied to richness, I think. And how do we know when too much change is too much change? So we're still work in progress. You have to think a little bit about this, but it's not clear yet to us. And I think I'm almost running out of time, so I'll skip a little quickly here and just talk a little bit about network robustness. I don't have to introduce it very much because Laura did that yesterday, which was great. So I'll just do that very quickly. That another important metric of stability is how stable trophic networks are. And the reason for this is that they represent energy flows in an ecosystem. So the more robust those energy flows are, the more robust the ecosystem should be as well. And we expect global change to keep causing primary extinctions, which could cascade into secondary extinctions, even if the climate niche is still suitable. And the metric of robustness should then be able to inform us about network stability. I think this could be a very promising resilience metric for managers and decision makers when we have the data. And the big question is, can we use these networks to infer ecosystem resilience across space and inform them these decisions? And I keep hearing from a lot of theoreticians in ecological networks, like, well, but we don't know enough. We don't know the variation. There's so much uncertainty. Like, yes, but we also know a lot. And we have more and more data. So let's not let that uncertainty stop us from trying to do something and trying to get these metrics into policy framing. And we have more and more large trophic data sets that we could use in a forecasting sense. There's like the European MetaWeb, there's GLOBE, there's inferred MetaWebs from marine and terrestrial systems. We have more and more availability of species distribution data that is not just in Europe and the US. And we have a generally good amount of knowledge of how many species, maybe if not all, but many species respond to various disturbances. If not in terms of their phenology and processes, at least we have a good impression of how ranges will change. And so we are proposing that we can combine this availability of knowledge and data to actually forecast changes in local food webs across large spatial scales and give us some boundaries of operation in terms of network resilience or robustness, and therefore ecosystem resilience or stability. And so basically what we do is we project species distributions under baseline conditions, build local networks across the space, and then we reproject the species distributions under some disturbance, could be climate warming or changes in land use, and rebuild the networks, and then count how many secondary extinctions do we have? So how many of these species still had a suitable climate or suitable habitat, but just lost their resources due to primary extinctions? And then we calculate robustness, and I'm not going to go over that very much, but it's a simple metric. And the results we've had, and this is just one scenario again, is that robustness varies from 0 to 1, being 1 being the highest, didn't lose any species, secondarily. And we see that across Europe, we have really high robustness to climate warming in a very extreme scenario. Even though we had a lot of primary extinctions, we didn't have a lot of secondary extinctions. And that's because we had a lot of colonization. So this goes a little bit to Laura's work on the colonization from other species. We didn't restrict dispersal or range shifts at all. So species do occupy the same functions within the network, and there's no secondary extinctions. And yes, this is completely anecdotal. We don't expect all of these species, and we had mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. They will not disperse in the same way across all these gradients. There will be, challenges to dispersal, fragmentation, and so on. But it does show the importance of dispersal for ecosystem adaptation and resilience to climate change. And it does provide this boundary of operation. This is literally our best case scenario under a super extreme climate scenario. The final thing I'm going to talk about in these last 2 minutes is the repeatability, the reproducible, repeatable, reusable, and transparent workflows that I've been working on. And I promise I'll try to be fast so you can all go and have coffee. Basically, I find this is, for me, one of the key things to tighten links between academia, practitioners, and decision makers. And these 3 concepts of repeatability, reproducibility, and reusability are not the same. Repeatability is the agreement of results obtained by the same individual, you, when you repeat your work using the same methods. How many people have tried to run their code and have failed? Yeah, me too. Forgot, what was that line? Why did I comment it out? I have no idea. So many of us are completely unable to reproduce our own work from 3 months ago. And then our packages also change and da, 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 da. Reproducibility is the agreement of results obtained by different individuals or groups using exactly the same methodology. And reusability is different. It's the ability to use the same methods, but in a different context. And we want to do that all the time. I've been so frustrated when I see this huge, really cool paper and I can't transfer it because, the code is not available. It's really cryptic or something like that. But this is the way science moves forward. It's by building on the shoulders of giants, right? And so reusability is built upon reproducibility, and reproducibility is built upon repeatability. They completely codepend. They codepend on transparency, but they also enhance transparency. If you are able to guarantee these 3, then what you did is transparent. And in my opinion, and the opinion of many, many others, these should be the pillars of all your projects, especially if they're depending on data, analyses, and models. Doesn't matter if they're theoretical or not, anything. And the production of results. So all of this should be in this sphere. Why? Because it enhances the trust between scientists, but also between scientists and stakeholders, the public, and whoever's in the field dealing with these ecosystems. It allows us to benchmark models and projections, theories, whatever. It allows us to do meta-analyses more easily. And it allows us to build on, as I said, and improve existing work. This is super important. To do that, we need to make sure that our projects are, the data that we use is fair. That means it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That all of our steps are integrated and hopefully automated as much as possible. No clicks, as fewer changes between operating systems and softwares as you can do, and that the final outputs can be repeated and are integrated in the reporting if you can. All of this should be self-contained. There's a few examples of how we can achieve this. And again, I'll be quick. The first one is two papers we've published. I published with Elliot and myself in Ecology Letters and Methods in Ecology and Evolution, where we propose a way to develop predictive models, predictive ecological models using these principles. Another interesting example is the Neon Forecasting Challenge by Thomas et al., where they're really trying to benchmark models that are trying to get at the same answer and the same challenge using iterative forecasting, and then just developing shiny apps that are targeted for stakeholders. It empowers them and makes everything you do transparent, and people can click, and they really love that. And so I'll finish off here. There's not much more I want to say, but I just wanted to make a little bit of a final plea and a final message where over the last few months, I've been working closely with government scientists, managers, and decision makers. And as I said, I've realized that the uptake of science is really not being fast enough to deal with the issues that we have. And, partly because there's uncertainty, we don't know everything. But a lot of it is lack of communication between academia, practitioners, and decision makers. But I guarantee that in many cases, these governments are really looking to us for answers, and they're desperate for these answers. So I know that if we put our minds to it, we can really get very useful metrics of resilience and stability to help them out and make things like response diversity more tangible. So with that, thank you very much. Sorry I went a bit over time, but I hope you enjoy that.
Okay, thanks, Ceres, for a really inspirational talk there. Really cool. We've got about 3 minutes for questions. I realized yesterday I should have been using the microphone because these series of talks are being recorded. So if you want to see any of the other 10 talks that we've had so far, you can watch them back on Zoom. Just let me know. But open to questions for Ceres right now. I saw Magna first.
Thank you. Hi, Ceres. That was a really nice talk, very fascinating to think of some of the implications there for management and linking the data to the management. I was just curious, and I'm sorry if I missed this, but would you be able to tell us a little more about the kinds of data that you might need for implementing such models, and what challenges might you have faced with the different kinds of taxa in forecasting from the models?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these two models are data hungry, but in the case of Lander, what we've been trying to do is that we embed the parameterization processes within the model so that somebody that is not a developer can just run the model in a new area, and the infrastructure gets the data by itself. It does that everything by itself. And if there's no data that is sort of inputted by the user, and we try to really avoid that, then it should just reparameterize itself and run. There is a lot of data that is needed. Lander has been developed within the Canadian context, so we're fortunate to have a lot of data that is spatially explicit across Canada. And so we're thinking about things like rasters of stand height, stand biomass, the proportion of different tree species. And that's where I said it's tricky to go into the understory, like shrubs and herbs, because there's where we don't have data, right? And so we have for some areas, but not for others. But I would say is not as data hungry as some other models, just because you don't need to, we found ways of parameterizing it with limited data. So yeah, it's not ideal, but at least it does it by itself. And your other question was about challenges with different taxonomic groups. That was very challenging for drought when I was trying to develop FATE, the drought model for FATE. Herbs and trees have extremely different drought responses, and the physiological mechanisms are completely distinct. You can't use the same traits or the same physiological attributes. And so I did a statistical approach. I basically looked at, if I look at past drought events, which species were able to survive all of these and be here in the present. So I basically did an historical analysis, spatialized. And then I said, well, if future drought is very far from the historical values, I think these species are going to suffer. And so it's sort of like, if I'm in the tails of that distribution of drought values, then I'm going to like kill them a little bit or affect their reproduction. But it was theoretical in the sense that I didn't have validation data for that. So it was an exercise of getting a botanist that really knew the park very well and say, does this look okay in terms of loss of species? And that was it. It's kind of like putting your finger to the wind. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for a very inspiring talk. I was a bit curious about your hypervolumes and your comparison. So you can go in as many dimensions you want in, yeah, you can think about it, but how tractable is it if you increase the number of dimensions? You said this, that then they can, of course, reach out in each and every dimension. Can you still track in which dimension is the overlap missing or so?
Right. So first of all, you can't go over 8 dimensions for hypervolumes. They become mathematically too small. They will never intersect. Just mathematically, they become tiny, tiny in that multidimensional space. And so what I did, I had more than 8 dimensions. I don't remember how many plant functional groups I had anymore, but definitely more than 8, like maybe 13 or something like that. And so what I did was I did an ordination analysis to simplify my multidimensional space into PC axis, and then chose a number of PCs, principal components, to feed to the hypervolumes and built it on there. So I had to collapse that multidimensionality into fewer dimensions. To your question of where it's changing and which dimension it overlaps, I don't think you can look at it that way. It's a multidimensional overlap, and it's hard for us because we think in 3 dimensions. You could just then plot 3 dimensions at a time and see where it's changing, but it's sort of an exercise of visualization. You can't get that out of the metric. The metric just tells you how much you are overlapping across all dimensions or not.
Okay, let's all go get some coffee. Rachel, you can talk to Ceres afterwards. Thank you. Thanks, Ceres, so much.
I don't think I understood. She was showing, she was computing volumes of the base of attraction, and then she said you can do it for your thing. Have a base of attraction, and then I realized that those weren't things. She showed like a display landscape, but that wasn't the axis the volume was on. I got very